if you can kind of identify what is important about the story that's being told, what are the dramatic elements of what's being told, the music almost kind of writes itself if you have taste. Every bit of what we do, regardless of, contemporary composition, commercial composition, it's all just a question of taste. So what music did you grow up with? What does happy sound like to you? What does sad sound like to you? If somebody plays you a clip of Wagner, what emotion does that elicit? But that's so much of the process for me. And certainly in film and TV is being able to have conversations about taste to find common ground so that you know what you're doing.
This is Music Maker with Tyler Kline, a podcast from Loose Leaf Transmissions. Howdy, y'all. Hope you are doing well, and welcome to another edition of the podcast. If this is your first time listening, it's so great to have you along, and just to let you know what you're about to get yourself into, my name is Tyler, and I'm a composer, a radio broadcaster, a podcaster, a curator, producer, a bit of a journalist, I guess, in light of this podcast, and that list just keeps going and going. But mostly, I would characterize myself simply as a maker. I really love to make things and create things. And on this podcast, I sit down with other creative people to discuss their journey, process, philosophies, basically whatever it is that makes them who they are and inspires them to be creators themselves. And if you have been listening for some time now, I really appreciate it. It's so good to have you here again. On today's episode of Music Maker, I'm joined by Austin Hammonds. With a seamless fusion of neoclassical orchestral mastery and contemporary production flair, composer Austin Hammonds delivers a contemporary twist on a timeless sound. He remains steadfast in his dedication to projects that allow him to explore the full spectrum of orchestral expression, whether crafting traditional orchestral landscapes or pushing the boundaries with innovative and less traditional scores. He is driven by a profound belief in the power of collaboration. Y'all, this conversation is a big one. So big, in fact, or maybe long is a better qualifier. So long that it's the first two-part episode. But it's well worth it. One of the many things that I love about this conversation is that, for all intents and purposes, Austin and I had the same starting point as musicians. We were in the same high school district in Kentucky. We went to the same school for undergraduate studies, that's Morehead State University. And then our paths went off in completely different directions. So we spend a lot of time talking about that. We also begin our deep dive into the world of film scoring from Austin's perspective in this episode. In this conversation, Austin shares thoughts on the importance of his composition mentors, and we touch on the role of taste in Austin's work, as well as matters of process and philosophy as it pertains to collaborating with directors and producers. This episode was quite an education for me. So sit tight, the conversation will get underway in just a bit. As always, some business here to share before we jump into the conversation. One of the simplest and indeed the best way for you to support this podcast is to listen to it. Listen to all of this episode. If this is your first time listening, listen to earlier episodes, or if not, revisit earlier episodes. Get your friends to listen if you think they would enjoy what we're all about, and then give us a follow on your favorite podcast platform. That will ensure that you get the newest episode as soon as it's released, pushed straight to your device. Also, an equally impactful and additionally a free way that you can help the Music Maker podcast is by leaving a rating or a review if you feel inclined and if you're able to. We have gotten a couple of those so far, and it's been so great to read your thoughts, but just that's kind of like just a slow trickle. So I'd love to share more reviews, comments on this podcast in this space. So if you feel strongly about Music Maker, if you value these conversations, let the world know. Please do be in touch. You can leave a review on Apple Podcasts, or on Spotify, you can now leave comments on each individual episode, kind of getting some conversation started there, I suppose. So ratings, reviews, comments, the more of those that we have, the more visibility the podcast has, and the more that we can grow the podcast and network. Now, on to my conversation with Austin Hammonds. Well, Austin, thank you so much for sitting down with me today. There's so many reasons I'm excited to talk to you, one of which, of course, is your work as a composer, but also it almost seems to me like we had similar starting points and then we kind of forked off into two totally different directions. So that's something that I'm also quite excited to dig into. So anyway, thanks again for joining me.
Yeah, of course, man. I mean, thank you again for having me on. Like I was saying just before we started, I think this kind of format is always preferred to me than, doing an interview and a text press release and all that kind of stuff, which is wonderful. But I think just being able to sit down as especially in this case, two people who kind of do the same thing and just have a conversation, it's wonderful. So I'm excited to chat after all these years.
I know, right? So I'm sure we'll get into that quite deeply here in a second. But where we like to start here on the podcast is as far back as you're willing to share, or as far back as you can remember. And that is, what is your earliest artistic memory as a composer, as someone who makes sounds, basically?
Ooh. I mean, that's such a hard question. I mean, I think there are kind of two or three key moments for me. Whenever I was a kid, of course, so many of us millennials or zillennials, whatever you want to call us, growing up with James Horner and John Williams and those kind of scores, being young and turning on the TV and listening to Feifel Goes West, or Jurassic Park that's on rerun for the 58th time that day. I think listening to those kind of scores and not even knowing what they were when I was a kid made such a difference. And it's something I think, every once in a while, and I'm sure we'll get into this later on, but I think sometimes is overlooked. Nowadays people think that children's TV or things that are targeted towards children need to be very simple. I tend to lean towards the opposite, but maybe that's just the way that I was brought up. But anyway, I mean, for me, Jurassic Park was kind of one of the first things that I remember as a kid, and just being obsessed with it, but not really knowing why. And then growing up later to realize that so much of the reason that I believed what was happening on the screen as a kid was because, the score was helping immensely with the suspension of disbelief and really taking you to this place that for all intents and purposes did not exist. Most of the dinosaurs were fake. It was a lot of it was practical, and then some of it was CG, but I believed that. And, I think growing up and later running into people like yourself at Morehead State University, and my big in the fraternity back in the day, Joe Rivers, we were sitting out on the wall, which I'm sure you remember fondly. And I was like, I want to be a composer, and I think I want to do film music. And Joe looked at me. He was like, okay. Well, we'll name 10 composers. And I couldn't, I had no idea what I was getting into, but the passion was there. And I think, again, going back to the whole childhood upbringing and that kind of thing, when you introduce a passion, or when a kid finds a passion, it doesn't really go away. Passion, I think, is something that's very important. And so here I am as a college freshman. No, I can't name 10 composers, let alone 10 film composers, but I know that this is something I want to do for the rest of my life. I mean, how naive, but also exciting of a position that was, knowing how much you had to learn, and yet it didn't really matter because you knew that that's what you wanted to do.
Yeah. Actually, I had pretty much the same exact experience as soon as I got to grad school, where my composition professor was like, "Can you name 10 living composers?" And I could not.
Yeah.
So, I know exactly what that feeling is. And it also, that kind of engaged my curiosity, I think. On one hand, it was like, oh, I felt so behind. But then on the other hand, it's like, oh, but yeah, you're right. So much to learn now.
Yeah.
Just from that one question.
Yeah. I think it unlocks a curiosity that almost is deeper than the passion itself, and then it becomes this kind of self-fulfilling cycle of thinking you know something and then being humbled and
Yeah.
realizing you don't, but then being excited by how much you don't know and how much is still left to, the term lifelong learner comes up. And that's something I often remind myself, and sometimes have to remind myself. The whole goal of this isn't to, I guess this industry, whether it be film composing or whatever. I think being a creative, being an artist, the goal is not to win. The goal is to learn and grow and to keep doing so. I would hate to think that I get to a point where I can comfortably say I know everything. I don't think that's ever going to happen.
Right.
And there's some people that do that, good for them, but that's not necessarily what I'm interested in. I think I hope that there is forever growing a ceiling limit above me, and the closer I get to it, I hope it just continues to move away from me. Yeah.
I feel you 100%. So, I mean, I'm curious about what you said about, noticing the music in particular in Jurassic Park as a kid. I mean, was that a common theme as you were growing up? Were you consuming media and just starting to pay more and more attention to the music, maybe almost prioritizing that?
I mean, I think it became that, but it wasn't something that I necessarily recognized until a lot later in my life. Again, I remember so many of these things as you bring them up. So I don't I don't want to seem like I'm just completely pulling these out of my ass, but it is something that is still very present to me. But How to Train Your Dragon was the first score, and I mean these are kind of quintessential scores that if you ask any film composition major, at least around my age, what got you into film music and blah blah blah. More often than not, it's going to be Star Wars, Jurassic Park,
Right.
or How to Train Your Dragon, and like these are, for better or worse, these are basic answers. But I also think there's something to that because in being basic, it's something that is being widely appreciated by such a like a large number of people. And I think there's something to that, something about these scores that these composers wrote, the John Powell and John Williams, something about these scores was able to touch so many people in such a deep way. So sure, Jurassic Park was the first one where I kind of noticed, oh my gosh, I love this music, I'm obsessed with this theme.
Mm.
But yeah, How to Train Your Dragon, I think, was the first one where I sat. Actually, I think it was the second one, but I remember sitting in the theater and just being like, wow, like I didn't realize that music had this much of an impact on A, the film itself, but B, my enjoyment of, I think I just kind of took for granted the films that I watched always kind of had good scores. And that said, I mean, there's so many movies that I haven't watched, kind of notoriously among my friends. We just recently have been watching the Lord of the Rings movies. I didn't watch them growing up.
I haven't either.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of walking.
Yeah.
There's a lot of walking, but
Yeah.
they're good. They're good movies. We still have an hour to go on the last one, but yeah, I mean, back to your question. I think it took me a while to kind of recognize what it was that I liked about these films, and it was something that I always walked away, humming a tune or whatever. But it took me a while to really appreciate what it was that was doing that. Another example too, and this might even dive into another topic, but another example that I think of often, I love animation. Animation is kind of a world that I would see myself fit into rather well. I've only done a few animated projects so far, but Willie the Opera Singing Whale, which was a cartoon. I want to say it was like the 40s or 50s, but I think I have that wrong. It was a very early, animated cartoon about. It was an interesting take on what would happen if they didn't shoot the whale, and the whale was actually an opera singer, and he gets up out of the water and starts singing. And then in the end, I'm pretty sure they kill the whale, which so I don't know. It was probably an allegory for something, but um, all of the operatic tunes that were being sang in the little short. I mean, these were these great pieces of opera history, and again, introducing kids to these important aspects of the zeitgeist, if you will, of, you know, music culture, world culture, nationalistic culture. It was really interesting. The same thing with like Fantasia. You listen to Fantasia and you're listening to some of the greatest works that have ever been written. It's no wonder that kids grow up and they're like, oh, wow, this music's really cool. Or like, I really have an appreciation for this.
So when would you say is the first time you put pen to paper and wrote music? And I say pen to paper, but very likely that's probably like
Uh,
putting something into a computer, which
right.
was the case with me,
Yeah.
too.
It was in 8th grade. And I tried to write a piece. There was a little tune. I still remember it. If this keyboard were live, I would try and play it. Or if that piano behind me was tuned well, I would. But I tried to write a piece and I was so proud of it. And I sat at the piano and I brought it in and we tried to read it. Roger Doss, shout out to Roger Doss. He was the middle school band director at well, what now is Ashland Middle School, but he's now the high school band director at Paul Blazer, which is where I went to high school. I passed it off to him and I was like, hey, can we read this in class today? He was like, yeah, sure. We'll read it, 5 minutes before the bell ends. And we read it. I everybody was playing the right notes. They were playing what was on the page, but it was this interesting moment for me where it didn't sound right. And I was frustrated about it. I was like, I don't know what's going on. And he was like, well, Austin, welcome to the world of composing. All these instruments are in different keys. So if you write something for,
oh no,
this instrument,
yeah.
blah, 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 blah. And I was like, oh my gosh, wait, there's so much. And again, we talk about this ceiling above us, this ever extending ceiling. And that was a very key moment for me that piqued my curiosity because there was something so simple now, as composers, we look back at it and we realize this, but at the time there was something so simple, this fundamental thing about writing for musicians that I just did not at all comprehend. And here I am trying to write a piece of music at the same time. I was learning the A flat trill so that I could play Go Big Blue with the high school
right.
band at the football team. So there's this big divide, and there's always been a big divide, I think, in what I wanted and what I was able to achieve at the time. And that was, that's a fun memory for me, I think, for sure. And then seriously, later on, I would do arrangements for our high school pep band, and we would read those, and a lot of times we would play them. Again, credit to Chris Whalen, my high school band director. He's since retired. Wonderful guy, believed in me, and I owe so much of, especially success is an interesting word, but especially early success, early learnings, to Chris. He was just pivotal in allowing me to explore all of these different kind of things. And I remember our high school band banquet, I believe. I tried writing a marching band piece. I mean, this time a little more successfully than in 8th grade, but I dedicated it to him and he played it. And it was this whole, I mean, I look back at it now and I kind of laugh about it. I wasn't meaning to turn it into something about me, but looking back, I kind of did. But I was so proud because of what I was able to do, because of what he taught me, because of what Roger and Chris both, taught me. And I wanted to share that. Oh my gosh, it was terrible. I think back to the piece now and it's just certainly not a work of art by any stretch, but an interesting dabble in craft. And I mean, after that, in college was kind of when I first started exploring it, which was an interesting time, being surrounded by people who their job is not only to teach you and to encourage you, but being taught and being encouraged in high school and being taught and encouraged in college are two very different things, So I did run into professors, and professors are personalities. I ran into professors who all of them very much had my best interest in mind, but some of them maybe weren't the best at expressing in a way that was understandable for me at that time what I needed to be doing better, or maybe even more importantly, why I needed to be doing it. It's one thing to be told, hey, you should be doing this. And of course, me being as we've kind of established, the person who has always kind of been curious about this stuff, why was sometimes not an okay question to ask. But I think, again, through that entire process, there was so much that I learned bringing it to, some familiar names for you, bringing it to Richard Miles and letting him, take a look at it and very honestly critique me. There's too much here. You need to spread this out. There's enough in this piece for 4 or 5 pieces. And it's like, wow, I mean, that's a good thing to hear, and Susan Cressup giving me feedback about the horns, oh, if you have them do this for this long, they're going to get tired. I mean, it was such an interesting period of time. Matt Taylor, another one, that believed in me in so many different times when he really shouldn't have, but he did. He let me mess up so often and let me get away with it so often. But I learned so much, and Moorhead was a place of growth for sure, because I think oftentimes, when you put pen to paper, sometimes you don't have, I mean, you certainly don't always have the answers.
Right.
And then sometimes you lean on people, and sometimes they do have great answers for you. Sometimes they don't. But I think it's so great to have people around you at every step. And I've been fortunate to have that, to be able to tell you something, even if it's the wrong thing, to be able to tell you something, to have some sort of backboard to kind of bounce the ball against, for lack of a better term, to get some sort of feedback, to understand a direction to go in. It's a very long-winded answer. There'll be a few more of those, but
I appreciate it. And I mean, just to kind of put this out there, because you've alluded to it, but the both of us attended Morehead State University, which I've talked about my experience there on this podcast, because what's interesting about us being products of Morehead is there is no composition program at Morehead. There's not even a composition teacher at Morehead. And so I'm sure, like myself, you had to figure out kind of on your own, how the heck am I going to, how am I going to do this? And you're right. Luckily there's plenty of faculty there, both, 10 years ago then, and also currently a lot of them are still there, who are mega supportive, but also on the flip side, like I said, when I got to grad school, it was like I didn't know anything.
Yeah.
Personally. Yeah.
And it's of course it's no fault of Morehead. I think, and I maintain this fact, and I maintain this opinion. People say different things about this, but I very much believe that Morehead is kind of a gem of the East Coast. You have these wonderful faculty, again, 10 years ago and still now, who have gone out and they've done these things, and people know who they are. Again, Richard Miles with all of his books on education. I mean, I was talking with I believe it's Blake Cooper. He's one of the session tubists out here, and turns out he's from Kentucky, which is wild. But he's like, oh yeah, Stacey Baker, and blah blah blah. And it's like, yeah, of course I do. She was, again, another, for both of us, another pivotal, person in our lives. She let me do arrangements for the tuba euphonium ensemble, and learn that way. So these are people that people know, and here they are in the foothills of Appalachia, giving an incredible education to people who, for better or worse, and this is just kind of the state of Kentucky, economically, may or may not be able to get out and do something, creatively as a composer or an orchestrator, or as a writer. I mean, let's even get out of music. Sometimes these kind of states are difficult to move out of, just because of their location, if nothing else. So it's wonderful to have such an incredible faculty at that place.
Yeah, absolutely. So when was your first encounter with a composer? Was that like a guest composer at Morehead? Because I think that's my answer to this question.
Yeah, I mean, I'm actually curious to hear your answer as well. So please answer this one yourself after I give mine. But it ties into our last question. I remember when I was looking at schools that I wanted to go to, I was relatively interested in music composition, but not interested enough. I hadn't really written anything. I wasn't going to get in on my compositional merit. Again, considering the fact that 4 years prior, in 8th grade, I didn't even know what instrument keys were, so right. It was an uphill battle. But I remember looking at Moorhead, and obviously Moorhead was, I was what, District 8. Shout out District 8.
Same. Yeah, me
But
too.
yeah, it was a good district. But Moorhead was like the school to go to for a lot of reasons. They had a big marching band. They had a great marching band. They had, still have, an incredible music education department and faculty. And there were a lot of really great performers that, you know, went out of Moorhead and got into grad schools at wonderful places. And what I did see, and it was still on the website, I vaguely remember this, but it was still on the website that music composition was an offered degree program because they hadn't updated the site.
Right.
And this had to have been when you were there, I believe, or around that time, because I was looking maybe in 2012, 2011. But anyway, they hadn't updated the site. I saw music composition, but I knew that it wasn't offered. I think I had called or something. But I did see Jay Flippin on the faculty list. And I remember getting to Moorhead, and immediately I wanted to connect with Jay, because it was like, oh my gosh, a living composer. He's doing the thing that I want to do. And he even dabbled in film music.
I do remember I took a class with Jay. Oh, what was the class? I don't think it. No, I took music business with Gordon Tao.
Yeah.
And Jay came in one day to speak, and Jay started playing this like radio jingle on the piano that I'd heard like my entire life on the radio from some radio station out of Lexington. And he was like, yeah, I wrote that.
Yeah.
I was like, what?
Yeah. And what better a way to see what it means to be a composer in this era,
right,
than to have this person who at my age I had never heard of before, who is, you know, he was probably maybe in his 70s at that point, 60s or 70s, clearly has had a life in music and has had a life in composing, who is still alive, doing well, and has been a composer his whole life, but not writing symphonies, not writing, you know, not doing these grand works that, you know, people, Bach and Beethoven and Stravinsky and Tchaikovsky, that's not what it is today. It can be, but it was such an unforgettable introduction into this field. And, you know, I remember I reached out to Jay and it was like, you know, I really want to do lessons. And he was like, well, yeah, I would love to take you on as a private student. And it was great. I think that was I had just written a lot of music, and it was the end of my freshman year. And I think it was the start of sophomore year. And unfortunately, I remember he had collapsed, I believe, in history of rock and roll. He was teaching history of rock and roll at the time. And I think he had cancer and passed pretty shortly after. This was maybe the span of a month or two. And it was so sad, not only, you know, because in a selfish way, there weren't my opportunity to study with a composer, and certainly for our area, the composer of our area, greater or lesser Kentucky, Appalachia. But also, you know, here's this person again, now on the flip side of this, that I have never met, that has clearly had this life of success and being a composer, who, you know, kind of falls ill and passes away. But there's so much great stuff. I mean, I'm sure if I Google searched him right now, there would still be things that I, you know, didn't know about him. And again, with the whole curiosity thing, I mean, I think it's regrettable the way that these kind of things happen, of course. But I was so curious by this kind of enigmatic figure in our community, Jay Flippin, who everybody knew, everybody talked about in very high regard, who I crossed over paths with very briefly for less than a year. And, you know, he may never know, but that was kind of the start of all of this for me, in a way, to see somebody and to know that this is possible, to have a life as a composer, let alone in Moorhead, Kentucky, you know?
right. Well, since you did ask, and I plan to do a whole episode where I answer all my own questions in the future, but since this will be a little taste of that, you know, in talking about it, I think I had some opportunities to maybe not meet face to face, but interact with composers through high school honor bands. So I'm
Mm.
thinking like Robert W. Smith
Yeah, of
and
course.
Sam Hazo,
Mhm.
all those big like high school, middle school
Yeah.
band composers. But yeah, it was in Moorhead where I started like, actually meeting composers face to face. And the most, I don't know if he's the most pivotal composer that I met during my time at Moorhead was composer James Grant, who was writing a piece for Symbiosis Duo, which is Dr. Baker's two euphonium duo. And so we were premiering a piece in the symphony band with Symbiosis Duo as the solo group that Jim Grant had written. And so I had an opportunity to take a lesson with him, and just automatically, like, that might have been my first real composition lesson,
Wow.
I think.
Yeah.
And and I still have lessons with him. I still talk to him regularly. He's a listener of the podcast. How you doing, Jim? And I hope to talk to him soon for the show. But at any rate, I mean, just that one little hour, maybe hour and a half, maybe it went long, lesson in Dr. Baker's office at Moorhead with this guest composer who I'd never heard of before totally changed the way I thought about music and approached music. Just like the feedback he gave me, and very, very gentle feedback, not like you got to do this to make it good. It's like, well, have you thought about doing this? And like, what if you did this? And oh, wouldn't this be really cool if you did this? And it's like you think about it for a second, you're like, yeah.
Yeah, that would be cool.
Yeah, I will do that. Thank you.
Right.
And
Right.
so anyway, not to keep gushing about Jim, whom I love, but yeah, I think that's my like official answer,
Yeah.
I think, to that question.
Well, I think, if I can riff off that as well, I think one of the first times is, if not the first time, or the first composer you meet, I guess I should say, is always important that way. And I think, one of the most influential composers that I've met, across the years. Two of my professors, actually a few of my professors, I got to study with Chris Boardman and Carlos Rivera. Carlos just did, well, I say just, Queen's Gambit was kind of his big one, and Hacks and Lessons in Chemistry, multi Emmy nominated. And I think all for different reasons that I will connect. And then also, some of my professors at USC, Patrick Kirst being one of them, and Eric Schmidt, all of which have had careers. So you meet somebody like Jay Flippin, and it's like, wow, this is so cool. And then you leave the nest, pun intended, because we were the Eagles at Morehead State University.
That's right.
So you leave the nest, and you see that there are so many people who are making a name for themselves, not only a life, but a name for themselves as well. And you get to, you ask the same questions, you ask different questions, and you get such a variety of answers and lessons. And I remember with Chris Boardman, he was so brilliant, so brilliant. We would sit there and listen to a cue in class, and he would go over the board and write out your entire cue, just sketch out your entire cue after hearing it one time. And that was it was my first year of grad school, and it was this whole kind of opening of my third eye, I guess, so to speak, as far as, wow, this world is massive. The stuff that he has worked on. And then my second year, Carlos had taken over the program, and the way Carlos's approach, I think, to life and music and the work-life balance thing. If Carlos listens to this, shout out to Carlos and his students over at Frost in Miami. I think one of the most important lessons I learned from him, and I still try every day to live this, is he was like, my goal is to be the same person I am professionally as I am personally, as I am as an educator. So you're not getting three different versions of Carlos. You're getting Carlos the dad is the same as Carlos the composer, is the same as Carlos the professor, and it was great because, I think being his TA, that was so true. And there was so much value that came from that. When you walk into a meeting with a director or a producer or somebody commissioning a work, and you just get this very level-headed, this is me. And if you like that, great. If you don't like that, I'm fine, because I get to be me. And that was something that was so valuable. And I carry that forward. And then, going into USC, I remember I was, again, naive, egotistical, somewhere between. I did a rescore Star Wars that quote unquote got me into USC. And I remember Patrick, he's very, very German. He was like, yes, this is what got you into the program. Like, let's take a look at it. And take a look at it from Patrick's perspective means absolutely ripping it to shreds, which I needed.
Yeah.
I very much needed.
I love that.
So combining everything that I just said about Chris and Carlos, Patrick's he's just this guy who is also ridiculously talented. So he hears my cue and he goes over and plays the whole thing on piano. He's like, but what if you did this? And your line writing is great, but it's kind of simplistic. So look at your harmony and blah, 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 blah. And he starts playing the cue better than I had written it. It took me a while to write that. I was so proud of it, but what a humbling experience that was. So I that semester I was very obsessive over, okay, well, I really, I need to impress, Patrick, but also there's so much work that I have to do. And it was exciting. But then with Eric was like, hey man, and I remember our lesson. And again, you get these kind of things that you need from all of these different mentors at different times. And Eric was like, hey man, you think a lot when you write, don't you? And I was like, yeah. And he was like, well, have you ever tried just like having a drink and calming down? And I was like, oh, no. And he was like, yeah, you should do that. And like, get back to me on how that goes. And it was such an A and B sided approach. But I mean, it was a great lesson from all of these different mentors. Again, kind of even going back to Jay, that the approach to writing, there isn't one approach to writing. So going back to one of your earlier questions, as far as the whole, pen to paper, when was the first time you put pen to paper? I mean, I feel like every single time I do something, I feel like it is the first time that I'm doing it. I mean, Alan Silvestri, who we met a few times when I was over at USC, shared with us on multiple occasions. He was like, every time I write something, it feels like the first time. Every time you stare at a blank page at a deadline, it's terrifying. But you call back on the experience of all of these firsts, the first composers that you met and the things that they imprinted on you, and the second, the third, the fourth, and it stacks up to be whoever the composer or the artist that you are today. I mean, it's a beautifully natural process, and I think one that is so uniquely different for everybody. So yeah, you can have the same answers to what score inspired you to do this, but your experience is so remarkably different that it really shapes you. And again, you and I sitting here having a conversation, nearly 10 years after we first heard of each other, going in completely different paths very successfully, is such a testament to that.
Well, and it's to say it's funny feels wrong, but I mean, it's so fascinating, I guess, because everything you're saying resonates so much with me and is so aligned with the experiences I've had with the composers I've met along my path, the composer mentors, I should say. But again, I mean, we make completely different kinds of music. Yeah. And I think that's sort of the whole point and the whole beauty of it all. Yeah. Really.
I mean, isn't it wonderful that we can sit here in the same industry? I mean, it's a term I use all the time, but in the same, creative space, doing two completely different things, coming from the same place. It's nice.
Tyler here, interrupting this conversation just briefly to let you know that you can easily help power the Music Maker podcast and Loose Leaf Transmissions Network in a big-time way by becoming a Patreon subscriber. By becoming a Patreon subscriber, you're supporting these fantastic conversations with makers in a real way. And one of the perks to being a subscriber is getting early access to episodes each week. And I've also launched a Patreon exclusive feature called The Workshop. It's sort of like an audio journal where I share a little bit about my own creative process as it pertains to some current composition projects that I'm working on. Anyway, yes, that little bit of support on the Patreon, in fact, does go a long way in helping me cover the cost of some tools that I use to produce this podcast. So I hope you'll consider becoming a subscriber by following the Patreon link in the show description of this episode, or you can log on to looseleaftransmissions.com/support. I really appreciate you getting back to me. And back to today's episode. So maybe you've answered this already, but I'll just ask you more directly.
Sure.
When was like the defining moment where you knew that you wanted to pursue your craft as a career, like to go all in professionally as a composer?
Yeah, I mean, it's funny. There are varying stages, I guess, that has happened kind of repeatedly. The definition of a composer, the definition of success, and all these kind of things being so almost intangible. But maybe it's better to walk it backwards. The most recent time, if I can be honest and vulnerable, this industry is constantly, and this industry being film music is constantly an ebb and flow. Every famous composer, or most of them at least, it's not W-2 income. This is not a job per se.
Right.
In this the way that most people consider what a job is. It's 1099 income. You're being hired. You're a work for hire. It's a contract. So recently, I was just laid off by one of the composers that I work with, through no fault of his. Everything is wonderful, and he is and will always be one of the kind of cornerstone mentors of mine moving forward into my career. Jonique Bontemps, he just did, I say just, it was almost 2 years ago now, but Transformers, Transformers
Nice.
Rise of the Beasts. Wonderful score. But the industry is in a little bit of a slump right now. We had all the strikes last year. Well, that's going to affect post-production about a year later. So here we are. The composers are usually the last ones to come onto the process anyway. So things are a little bit slow for him. So he had to lay me off, and I was working as an assistant, and for him that is anything from tech to doing additional music and that kind of thing. So I never felt less than or anything. If anything, I always felt like a partner with him. He's wonderful. But currently, I feel like, in a weird way, this is the first time where I'm making the decision to step out and kind of do my own thing as a composer. Maybe from the first decision to do that, going to grad school, well, is that really, you're still in a nest, you're still safe, right. You are making a career and a name for yourself, you're starting, but being a student is very different than being a freelancer, is very different than being a W-2 employee. So graduating grad school and moving to LA was certainly another one of those. But again, I moved to LA as a grad student at USC. So does that really count? Graduating USC and then realizing it was possible. I mean, I guess I knew it was possible, relatively speaking. Otherwise, I wouldn't have gone into like $150,000 in debt, student loan debt, to do it. But, so the story goes. I think maybe the first time, I graduated from USC, and it was 2020, which was, kind of the height of the Black Lives Matter and COVID simultaneously. And, the phone rang, and it was Russell Emanuel over at Bleeding Fingers, which is Hans Zimmer's, composer collective that he, works with, or they do work for him. And they wanted me to come on board. They realized they kind of needed to diversify a bit, for better or worse. And I think that was maybe one of the first times where I was like, oh, wow, okay, this is a job. This is an industry. I remember when I was in school and I was like, okay, what might I want to do with this whole composing thing? This was at Moorhead, and I looked up starting salary of a film composer. And I was like, okay, well, this doesn't seem terrible. I'll do this. There's money, at least some. I was so wrong, but there's enough. But yeah, and then graduating, going from 10 years later, graduating and working almost 10 years later, but graduating and then working at Remote Control on Hans's campus with my own room, my own assistant. It was great, and getting to collaborate with still some of the dearest friends and some of the most wonderful young composers over at that place. I mean, it was an invaluable experience, but one again that I still almost would not consider making a career or making that decision. A great example of everything that I was just talking about. Bleeding Fingers is W-2 income, which is great. It's a wonderful thing to not have to worry about where your next paycheck is. But that also means that it's not really your decision on the direction that your career goes, or the projects that you're working on, or even in some cases what your day-to-day looks like. And that's not really something that I wanted. And I think, to maybe more directly answer your question, it has only really been in the past year that I have truly kind of looked at myself and where I've come from, and also where I would like to be moving forward, that I started making these kind of decisions where it's like, you know what? No, this is something that I want to take seriously on my own.
Yeah.
I've seen how other people do it. I've seen how mentors have done it. I've seen how Hans runs his business and runs his camp of composers. I've seen how those composers and dear friends of mine run their rooms and their assistants. And I think I just want to do things a little bit differently. And it takes a little bit of courage to make a decision like that. And it's something, again, coming back to JB, Janique, he was very encouraging. When I left Bleeding Fingers, I started doing work for him, was for the past year. He was very encouraging the entire time I was there. He was like, look, see this as a stepping stone. You're just working with me to get somewhere else. You're going to see how I do things, and I want you to go off and be your own composer. So treat your room like your room, treat your work like your work, and go kind of take on the world. And I cannot thank him enough for that. But again, the decision is still mine to make on when I make that call. So it's a very roundabout way to answer the question, but I think really the question is maybe the past 3 to 4 months that I have made the decision to really take this career, quote unquote, seriously as my own composer, and see what that even means. What does that mean? Who is Austin Hammonds? Who is this guy? Let alone, funny enough, breaking the fourth wall here, let alone who is this guy that your listeners are listening to? But for me intrinsically, who is this guy that I keep saying I want to become, but haven't quite pulled the trigger on yet? And I'm excited and I am curious about where this goes over the next year or so. I mean, hoping, knock on wood, hoping that I don't just fail and flop. But I can't really accept that as a possibility, because if I do, it'll happen.
I think I think it's interesting and inspiring what you're describing, because I think for a lot of people, and this isn't a criticism. It's just,
Yeah.
people live their lives the way they live it and proceed through their
Right.
lives the way that they do. I think a lot of people don't have the level of self-reflection that you're talking about. And so, like you start school doing the thing, and then you just stay on the track, and if it serves you, maybe you don't think too much about it and you
Yeah.
just keep going.
Values like that, for me, I have to give a credit to my mom and family. Everybody brings up their family as a thank you and that kind of thing. But, I was so fortunate to have a mom who raised me to just follow whatever it is I loved. Doesn't matter what it is, just follow it.
Yeah.
And I think that does it makes you think. It makes you almost have to think and self-reflect from a young age to figure out what it is you love. What does love even mean when it comes to picking a career, or choosing to follow something blindly into this this void of time that is just kind of laid out in front of us. I consider myself very fortunate for that, and I think it's hard sometimes too, because there certainly is something on the other side, something to be said of being too self-reflective, which I have gone very far off the deep end in terms of imposter syndrome, and
Mm.
being so reflective that maybe you're not anything when you're comparing yourself to these giants. And I mean, the first time I moved to LA, I almost hated it, which is kind of like weird to say, but I moved here and knowing that somewhere at the time I didn't know where, and I certainly didn't know that I would end up there, but within a 10-mile radius of me when I moved to LA was Hans, and he was working, So here is this new kid on the block who wants to become a composer, and Hans and John Williams and John Powell and James Newton Howard, all these composers that I grew up, aspiring to be like, are all just around you.
Mm,
I think I have been forced to self-reflect, painfully so, but thankfully, when you're surrounded constantly by greatness, including being surrounded by great parents. So I'm very, very fortunate.
I understand.
Yeah.
Yeah, I feel the same way about the people in my life as
Yeah.
well, and so yeah, I'm really interested in digging into your process again
Sure.
because what you do is so different from what I do, and so you're going to be educating me.
Sure.
But
Yeah.
so, you've worked across such a diverse range of media. You've done video games, documentaries, TV,
Mm.
film. How does your approach to scoring differ across these formats, and how do you adapt to the unique demands of each of them?
It's a really interesting question. I'll try to give an answer that isn't too composer for me or jargony, as so that it's not specifically for composers. And if I start to, I'll weave my way back. I think it all is drama. That's the general answer. Anytime you ask somebody in film and TV, is it all has to do with drama. And I think when you approach something and you're looking at drama as it pertains to story, I guess maybe is a better answer. So maybe story. If you can kind of identify what is important about the story that's being told, what are the dramatic elements of what's being told, the music almost kind of writes itself
Yeah,
if you have taste. And this is the fascinating, thing that maybe we can get into the weeds about, that is less so composery. It's all taste. Every bit of what we do, regardless of, contemporary composition, commercial composition, it's all just a question of taste. So, what music did you grow up with? What does happy sound like to you? What does sad sound like to you? If somebody plays you a clip of Wagner, what emotion does that elicit? And kind of keeping track of these kind of things, right? So I remember when Chris Whalen was retiring, my high school band director, I went to visit him, and we had this, to me, one of the most fond moments personally that I have had, certainly with him, but with any of my mentors, maybe. He was on the podium and getting ready to retire after an absolutely incredible career as a high school band director. And he's getting a little emotional and, choked up in front of the kids. And, afterwards we have this whole conversation, and I kind of, he's like, I'm proud of you, blah, blah, blah. And I was like, yeah, but I mean, I don't think you realize how much of my taste was actually informed by his. So being able to sit down with somebody and have a conversation where he shares with me Elsa's procession to the cathedral, and then we talk about what that feels like, but we're doing this in class as high school students, but how that informs the way that I look at my own taste moving forward, right? But that's so much of the process for me, and certainly in film and TV, is being able to have conversations about taste to find common ground so that you know what you're doing. So if you a director, are coming to me, because we're problem solvers,
yeah,
is
right,
what
exactly.
film composers are really. Oh, my movie, I want it to sound like this, and like I wrote the script and I've gotten to this point, and like this isn't the movie that I wrote anymore. And then we have to come in and fix it. Or in some cases, and I just recently had this, the film is exactly what they wrote, and they love it, and they don't want you to, for lack of a better term, they don't want you to f up. So how do you not mess this up? And it's incredibly daunting. But again, it all comes back to a conversation about drama and story. If I can sit down with a director and say, okay, well, let me put together a playlist for you to listen to, and I will always send them some of my favorite classical works
Mm,
to listen to, that I think might fit the general feeling of what they're talking about. So there's a director I work with, Anant, and we were working on a short of his, and I sent him a maybe 57-minute long playlist called Classics for an Aunt. And I was like, hey, take a listen to this And if anything speaks out to you, let me know. And, in it were things like the planets, which he resonated with. He was like, oh, wow, I really like, it was either Saturn or Jupiter. I think it was Jupiter. He was like, man, I really like this. Now, it was not great for the film. It was not right at all. That wasn't the right vibe for what we were talking about. But what was interesting is now we're having a conversation about Gustav Holst. We're not having a conversation about the story.
Right.
We're not having a conversation even in some terms. We're not even having a conversation about music, but we're having a conversation about something that to me means pages of research or pages of study, of practice. And we're in a realm that I can have a conversation with him about story. And from his perspective, he's hearing story, drama, great. This guy gets me. He understands what we're talking about. But in my brain, it's a conversation about orchestration. It's a conversation about, oh, okay, so he thinks that the chorale in the middle of Jupiter sounds incredibly soulful and sad. And to me, okay, great. So what I need to do for this is dive really deep into string orchestration. So what are some of the other things that I can think of with Holst that I can compare this to? Let me go listen to Mahler. Let me go listen to some Mahler symphonies that are similar, and let me send him some of those and see what he thinks about that. That is so much of the process for me. So whether it is, I worked on a BBC documentary, Eden, Untamed Planet, which was a blast to work on. Whether it's, scoring a scene with a sun bear and the sun bear goes to sleep. So, hey, let's nod to Eric Whitacre here because that's part of the zeitgeist that I understand. Let's shape something in a similar way that Eric Whitacre does the ending of Sleep, where it just kind of, tapers off. Or there's a scene, where thousands, I actually think they say millions or billions, which I think is actually true, but of bats exit the cave. Yeah, let's do a little reference or a nod to Batman, or which really is just a nod to Wagnerian brass and or Bruckner chords and that kind of thing. So it's just like all of it is something else, and I think that is the thing that I love so much about the process. And it's not uniquely my process. This is very much something that I take from Williams' interviews, where he talks about the same thing. I look to the past to try and inform the present and the future, because I think that is what is so beautiful about our craft, our art, depending on what side of the aisle you look at it from, but is this lineage that continues to go forward. Right. And yes, it's ever changing. It constantly is changing. And sometimes you have these incredibly robust offshoots of what we're doing. These true artists come along. I mean, Johan Johansson is comes to mind, that does something so unique at the film Arrival. And then that becomes the sound model for, 4 more generations of composers. I mean, the amount of times that I have meetings with directors where they're like, yeah, I really like this Johan Johansson track. And it's like, oh yeah, great. That's wonderful. So who inspired Johan Johansson? I'm not going to look at him. I'm going to look at who inspires him to see if we can find something of a similar language, because the process of creation, I mean, especially in film music, is very, very approachable. It's very worldly.
Right. Well, and as you alluded to before, I mean, I'll always say it, like the most common contemporary music that is consumed by people on Earth is movie music, right?
Yeah. I mean, it's one of my favorite facts, only because naively, when I was young and in college, I used to have this saying, and whether or not I believe it now, I'll maybe leave up to the public to decide. But, I think when people look at this period of time, 100 years from now, 200 years from now, assuming that we don't just blow ourselves up in this next election, I think people will look at the marker being film music. I think the contemporary composers of the olden day, and I guess we're talking about pre-impressionism and romanticism, but they were working for somebody. The work that they were doing was for somebody else. And I mean, even when you get into romanticism. I mean, I think they were doing self-expression, and we start to get into all of these different periods of time. I mean, I'm not great on my music history, but I know enough to say there's always been a catalyst for writing music, and it always has been someone else. And only really in the past period have we seen people doing it for music's sake. And now, of course, this is in the Western classical form. You
Yeah.
know, cultures of everywhere around the world have been doing music for music's sake for hundreds of years, if not thousands of years. But all of that to say, it is interesting. And I think a lot of people will look back at this period of time and think of the great composers of our era as film composers, which it's just fascinating because it's just another medium that is technically for something else. I mean, I'm not, this is a soapbox I've been on recently. Maybe that will change, but I'm not an artist. I don't necessarily, at least right now in my career, I don't necessarily want to be an artist. I would rather be regarded as an excellent craftsman. You know, the job of a film composer, fortunately, unfortunately, is to come in and I'll steal a good friend of mine's analogy, Julia, that our job is to come in and lay carpet. And if the person whose house we're putting carpet down in doesn't like the carpet, well, we pull it up and we put down a different color. If they said they wanted red, and we put down red, and they're like, well, why'd you put down red? I wanted blue. Well, our job is to say, okay, cool. Yeah, let's put down blue. What shade?
Yeah.
What shade do you like? You know? And I think where the art is, and the art comes in time, which is why it's not something that I'm focused on right now. I think where the art is creating something beautiful within the confines of those expectations. You know, you have X amount of time to do this. Let's put down a blue carpet. Well, what can you do with a blue carpet? You can explore shapes, you can explore depth, you can explore, I mean, so many different materials that you make the carpet out of. I mean, I'm getting a bit into the weeds, but the point stands that I think it's an interesting conversation that's had about art and craft in this industry specifically.
Something you said earlier about sending these directors playlists,
Mm.
I thought was really interesting because, whenever somebody, I'll back up a second. The best piece of advice I've ever been given by not well, I'm painting with broad brushstrokes. One of the best pieces of advice I've ever been given by a mentor composer is that, when a commissioner comes to you and they say, I'd love for you to write me a piece, let's talk. The number one question to ask them is, what music do you like that I've already written? Because
Right.
if you don't establish that boundary, at least, I mean, it's just like, what if they're expecting, if somebody came to me and they're like, oh, can you write something like Star Wars? I would be like, why are you asking me this? It's like, sure, I'll try. I'll take your money.
Yeah.
But
You also would say yes because you're perfectly capable.
right. But, nevertheless, it'd be like, well, why are you asking me?
Right.
And what you're saying is also another question I might ask, like, or you can look at a performer's repertoire that they play and see what kind of music they enjoy playing by other composers, and
Right.
that could inform what you do. But I love the idea of sending someone a playlist of music that
Yeah.
you like, that resonates with you as a composer, that can get some sort of a conversation going. I mean, I think you
Right.
can apply that to the concert stage, not just,
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, I think too, there's an important term, I guess, in our field that is related to exactly what we're talking about. It's called temping, temp music, which is just temporary music that is placed over the film that is meant to be replaced. And there's a syndrome that often happens that we call temp love, when a director falls in love with whatever is there because that's what they've been editing to. In some cases, that might even be what they shot to, but they fall in love with it, and you kind of have to beat the temp, because ultimately, if the director temps something with something, generally there's got to be a little something in there that they like. Even if they're like, ignore the temp, I don't really like it. It's almost 100% guaranteed that you will come back to it and they'll be like, well, yeah, but I really like where this lands, or I really like that this shifts here. I don't like the music, but I like the way that and it's like, oh, okay, so there is something you like about this. But yeah, I think the playlist approach, albeit something new that I have been doing, is kind of a modern way of working around process of temping. Hey, don't temp your film, or maybe if you do, have that copy for yourself. But let's see if we can find some common ground before I put pen to paper, and we can maybe make some of the process easier. And you always have to end up having a conversation about temp. I mean, it's in the modern era. I mean, even not in the modern era, kind of famously, a lot of John Williams stuff was specifically Star Wars was temped with some of these older scores with Wagner and Tchaikovsky and all of these greats, and Williams kind of has to come in and figure out how to do that. But the beauty in it also is that's part of having to beat the temp is also kind of what made him so good at what he does. When your temp is Holst the planets, I mean, famously, when they blow up the Death Star is almost note for note, chord for chord, nearly in the same key as Mars, as the climactic ending of Mars. When you have to beat the temp, well, great. Okay. He might have pulled the same exact 8 to 12 bars and reworked that, but everything up to that 8 bars has to be just as good as Gustav Holst, if not better. So having to beat it is just as wonderful a challenge as having a conversation about it to figure out where you need to be in the first place. And I really like what you bring up about talking about commissioners commissioning pieces, but specifically writing a piece for a soloist and what have they performed from. That's a really, really great, that's a great point. It's not the same perspective that I think about my work in, but it very much is the same thing. Yeah. There's a lot of crossover. I'm sure we can find even more.
Make a whole separate podcast series about it.
Yeah, 2 guys, 2 composers.
They do nothing the same. Yep. But
we'll call it Note for Note.
Yeah.
2 composers.
Let me write this down. Yeah, I like it. I'm looking for more podcasts to do. I don't have time for that, but maybe soon.
Same.
I mean, is beating the temp? I mean, you're talking about it like it's just a regular thing that everyone has to do. Is it that? I mean, is it so common? Would you say?
Temping is very common.
Sure.
It is. It's very common just because there has to be something that gets talked about, So let's go above and beyond as far as process goes, or at least above and beyond the scope of my involvement in these processes. Even directors have to answer to somebody. So the executive producers or the studio or the network or whoever it is, well, they need to bring a cut to them before the composer gets involved, because they very likely have not even hired or approached a composer at this point. But they need to bring a cut or a rough cut or dailies or something to those people to make sure that what the director is doing, they're happy with. Producers are especially nowadays, producers kind of have their creative hands in things a little bit stronger than maybe, in my opinion, they should. But they need to understand what's being made. And it's really hard to sell a picture when half of it's missing.
Right.
Let's look at a famous painting and then take away the color and talk about what emotion it's trying to convey. That's exactly what looking at a film without a score is. And I think some of the best directors understand that. And they also understand the importance of score. I mean, I don't work with a lot of young directors, and by young I mean my age. I kind of work with the same 5 or 6 directors on everything that they work on, let it be shorts or their first features or whatever. And then there's a considerable gap, and then there's some network stuff that I've worked on, and BBC and the History Channel and that kind of stuff. And I think when you're dealing with showrunners and executives and all of that kind of thing, I think they already kind of have an idea in mind of what they want. So it is very temp heavy. You get a cut with temp in it, or you get a cut, and sometimes, for better or worse, you get a cut and maybe it doesn't have music, but it has notes, and it's like, this is what we want. We'd like it to do this here, this here, this here. That's really informative. I don't necessarily think it's limiting per se, but with the directors my age that I work with, they understand the importance of score and dramatic storytelling, and they bring me on board at the scripting stage. This is early pre-production, and they're like, hey, this is what I was thinking. This is the vibe. What do you think of this? And there was a proof of concept I just did with a really talented director I work with, Akil Anderson. And we had a whole conversation about tone when he was still drafting versions of the script to send to, producers and possible financiers. So we go to shoot the proof of concept, and he does the whole thing on film, which is kind of telling. When a director is paying attention to the craft in that way, your ears perk up a little bit, because you're like, all right, if they're shooting on film and it's not just for some self-aggrandizing reason, and it's because they really want to pay attention to the craft, they really want to pay respect to the craft and figure out what it means to work with that craft, as opposed to digital or the things that we're kind of in nowadays. Yeah, your ears perk up a little bit, because you're like, okay, I need to pay attention to what he's saying, because he certainly knows what he's talking about. And by knows what he's talking about, I think it's very important to say he knows what he wants. And I think that's an interesting. I'll set that aside, and I'll revisit it. But so we start having conversations about score, and he'll play some things to me, and I'll play some things to him, and we're not talking about temp. We're just talking about playlists. We're talking about tone and that kind of thing. But I can start writing, while they're shooting, which is not unheard of. I don't want to say that in a way that it's some sort of special process. But I think when you work with directors and you get their trust, they bring you on early, and you get to do this very regular process. But it's so important, I think, to the collaborative process, because again, you're finding common ground. And even then, on the common ground you stand on, I mean, it's not always steady ground, for sure. I had a conversation with John Powell about this. He was talking about the difference between knowing what you're doing and being in control of what you're doing. And I think it's something I definitely want to share with people. John Powell worked with John Williams on Solo, the Star Wars story. And John and I were talking about this, and he was like, look, I don't know what I'm doing. And that might seem like some shocking revelation, but I don't know what I'm doing. But that doesn't mean I'm not in control of what I'm doing. I know the decisions that I want to make to get me to the point where I need to be. But to say that I know what I'm doing, I mean, nobody really knows what they're doing. And hearing this from one of the people I look up to most, as far as, musical caliber, and especially as far as I understand him as a person, I mean, he's wonderful. He will always take the time to have an actual level-headed conversation with you. And it was really cool. And he said the same of John Williams. He was like, he looks up to John Williams the same way that I look up to him. And he was like, getting to work with him was wonderful. But even looking up to John Williams, seeing him work and talking with him, I was kind of shocked that he also didn't have this air about him that he knew what he was doing. But it was very clear that he was in absolute command of what was going on at any given second in a session, in conversation about direction and like this kind of thing. I mean, it's fascinating, again, to hear the people that you respect so much talk about their process,
right,
and how that can inform you and how you approach that kind of thing. So working with Akil on this proof of concept, I had to know that I was in control of this beast that we were trying to make. I mean, it was a really unique score idea. And perhaps at some point the feature will be made and released, which is kind of the goal. That's where we're at right now, is funding. But it was a really unique take. It was something that I hadn't really done before in a voice that I'm familiar with, the orchestra. But how do you score a nightmare comedy when that's not really something that, and it's shot to film. Again, it's in black and white, and it's not an animation. It's trying very hard to be something that hasn't been made before, respectfully so as well, because it's paying so much attention to the craft. But it was a really, really interesting time for me to try and do something that I hadn't done before in a voice that I am comfortable in, knowing that I am in control of what I'm doing, but not feeling like I know what I'm doing at all. And I mean, I think that's something, hopefully, if there are other film composer viewers or listeners to this, I mean, hopefully this is something that we can kind of relate to, because it's something that we're going to, again, I mentioned it earlier in the podcast, but Alan Silvestri says the same thing. Every time I look at a blank page, it's the same feeling, So yeah, I mean, it's interesting, but again, it's that kind of call to curiosity. You know, how am I going to do this? And I think the final product was something I certainly was proud of. I absolutely could have made it better. Listening to it and watching it, I would have done something very different. But that learning process, especially with the words of wisdom from your graders, is just it's so much fun, and I can't wait for the next time to get to do it.
You mentioned earlier that you think a lot about
Yeah,
things. I'm the same way. And one of the things that I always come back to when I'm getting stressed over the work I'm doing or the projects I'm taking on, or it's like, I'm just making all this up. We're all just making it all up. Like,
yeah,
and also it's not like I'm like operating on someone's body, like a brain
right,
or something.
right,
I'm not a neurosurgeon.
yeah,
And yeah, I think that's so important that you surely cannot know what you're doing, but still be in
right,
control of the work that you do. And I think that also speaks to standards, and there's all sorts of layers to that I can
yeah,
appreciate.
yeah. And I mean, I wish, I wish I could take credit for that thought, but again, I mean, it's something I had in that moment with John Powell, and it's something I will carry with me, I think, for the rest of my life because it's
Right.
comforting. You know, it's comforting to know that
Yeah.
the people you look up to most are kind of exactly like you,
Yeah.
and it's wonderful.
Just out of my own curiosity, do you still find time to compose for the concert state, like just straight up concert music?
Oh,
Uh,
you should ask all of the saved unfinished files I have in Sibelius uh, that question and see their answers. I mean, on a serious note, yes and no. I don't make enough time.
mm,
I think finding time and making time are two very different things. When I find the time, yes, I absolutely try to. I currently have a page on my website right now that is hidden from view, but it's a the launch of my concert music that I have written over the years.
awesome. Yeah.
All the way back from undergrad, which are maybe things that I shouldn't release. Maybe not the best work,
I know that
but
feeling.
yep. But somebody might, you never know. Somebody
Right.
somebody might really like. But one of the pieces I wrote in undergrad, it's a short little 1 minute piece. I mean, Ben Morris, my best friend and now saxophone professor at Moorhead, where we studied saxophone together, he's performing that on a recital. So he liked it. He liked it enough, and we premiered that on my senior recital. Oddly enough, but yeah, I mean, back to the whole making time, finding time thing. I don't make enough time for it, and it's something that's very important. I mean, I jokingly, speaking of Ben, I jokingly have been working on a saxophone concerto since my undergrad. Now that's been about 7 years ago. I graduated in 2017. So yeah, it still sits in its many iterations on my computer, but along with what we were talking about earlier, as far as taking things seriously and when do you really want to go out and take the step to be a composer? I mean, composer is that's a broad brush. It's a broad statement,
Yeah.
and especially nowadays, we talk about Jay Flippin and Carlos Rivera, John Powell. I mean, three varying degrees of what a composer is in film music alone, let alone the contemporary, the John Adams and the like. As I kind of step into this new era, I think I do want to take more seriously concert music. And it's funny, I am a young 28-year-old composer who has had a little bit of success, however you will define that, in this field. And I'm saying this, but at the same time, John Williams, at the age of 92, 93 now, is also saying, man, I'd really like to write more concert music. And it's just like, man, that's so fascinating. But I mean, it's a unique opportunity, I think, for us because film composers, and I'm sure contemporary composers as well, when somebody else is asking for your work, as we just talked about, you kind of have to go to somebody else's standards and find your voice in that.
Yeah.
But sometimes when you just write music for yourself, I mean, which again you do have to make time for, that's a very unique process, and for me, it's terrifying You know, I look at contemporary composers with a lot of respect, going into something with nothing, with no direction. And of course they you beautifully said this. You just kind of make it all up, which is so cool. That's just fascinating. But that's incredibly daunting to me, to just from scratch make something up. There's a brass fanfare that I've been working on for a little bit. Hopefully I will finish and release here soon. But yeah, that's part of the reason the saxophone concerto has gone unwritten or unfinished for so long. Is it is from scratch. There's nobody telling me, oh, you should make this better. Oh, you should, do this a little bit differently. And if I can share a story related to this and related to process and the things that we've been talking about.
Yeah, please do.
Matt Taylor, saxophone professor from Morehead State University, used to, now at University of Central Arkansas, I believe. We had a conversation recently about the saxophone concerto. I was like, what is it to do a consortium and a commission and all these different things? Because as a film composer, your world is completely alien to me. So we had this whole conversation, and I wish it was him telling this story. He beautifully put it. He was talking about I'm going to butcher this, a comedian, I think, that was telling a joke about being a prostitute, and what the worst part of the job was taking the stairs. It's not the job, it's not the work, it's taking the stairs. I just don't want to take the stairs to go up.
Yeah.
And what this was meant to be was a conversation between he and I about process. And for me, with contemporary composition, and well, I mean, I guess it's all contemporary composition, but with concert music in particular, is the process is daunting because you are starting with nothing. So what is it about the process? And this is what we were talking about. What is it about the process that we can make easier, or that I can make easier for myself to initiate that healthily, but also comfortably? And it was a really interesting conversation about, working with musicians, working with artists. Clearly my process almost has to be collaborative. I sit down with a director or a producer, and this is what we want, this is what we're looking for. Okay, great. I go off and do my thing, I bring it back, we do revisions, and we get it right enough. It's never right, but we get it right enough for release. And he was like, maybe maybe you just need to look at the stairs and approach the stairs in a way that is a little bit more comfortable for you, so that way you can go do the work that you enjoy. Now, in his comparison, maybe prostitution isn't something that everybody enjoys, but that's the job. So the job for me now has become this really interesting conversation that Matt and I were talking about what it means to be an artist, and what it means to be an artist in his mind, in the context of this conversation, was finding a way for you to comfortably approach making your art, and to do that as consistently as possible. And it was one of the most eye-opening conversations that I've had, certainly in recent memory, because I felt like there was this weight lifted off of how I approach something that is very daunting to me. Now, I say all of this sounding all enlightened, but since that conversation, I don't think I've touched that saxophone concerto.
Yeah.
So the stairs are still getting in the way. But, I think it was the start for a conversation with myself about how I want to approach concert music, how I want to approach collaboration in my own career field, even with film music and that kind of thing. I mean, I mentioned my friend Julia Newman. Her and I were talking about the same conversation much earlier. This was a few years earlier than the conversation I was having with Matt. And she said something similar. She was like, Austin, I think you just need to find whatever your process is. And she was like, I'm trying to find mine now. I don't know what that is. But isn't that beautiful that we can sit here and have a conversation about things we don't know and be excited about them? And, something I've said a few times throughout this conversation, our conversation. But yeah, I think I'm just now coming around after all of these conversations. I'm just now coming around to what my process is, and how directly tied, more directly to your question, how directly tied it is to me making music for myself, which is not something, I'm relatively unashamed to say this, but which is not something I think I knew how to do prior to this year. And I can't necessarily say I know how to do it now, because again, the saxophone concerto is still sitting there. The the brass choir piece is the fanfare is still sitting there. So it's something I'm constantly having to come back to. But every time I come back to it, it gets a little bit easier, specifically because of conversations like this, where you get to sit down with somebody who knows a little bit more than you do about something, and they ask you the right questions, and you get to then start questioning yourself.
Right. Yeah, I hear you. It's I'm in a very weird spot right now with my whole artistry, I guess, for lack of a better word, in that, there's a piece I'm working on. And for those who are Patreon subscribers, you've maybe heard me talk about this. I have like a little bonus episode where I just talk about my own craft and
Yeah, good.
process
I love that.
around specific projects. And I've been working on a project for solo piano for it's going on like 2 years. I'm afraid to say 3 years. And for the longest time, it was, I wrote this stuff and I was very unsatisfied with it, and I kept trying to rehash it, and I would massage it, and it's gotten to a point where it's like after 2 years, I know what needs to be done, and now I just don't have time to sit down and finish it.
Yeah,
and
yeah.
and then I have another project on deck after for a commission for saxophone and piano that is highly experimental in a
Mm.
variety of ways. And it's like, I need to finish this piano piece because if I move on, I think this piano piece is prompting me to like reflect on myself and evolve in a certain
Right.
way. And I can't move on
Oh,
until I finish it. You know what I mean? And so
yes.
I'm in a similar boat, I think, that
Yeah.
you're describing.
Well,
Yeah.
absolutely. And I mean, something you said, I really want to highlight too. This piece that I'm working on, how did you say it? This piece that I'm working on is making me reflect
Like I'm having to
on
confront, yeah, I'm
myself.
having to
Right.
confront some things about the work I do. Yeah.
What an interesting part of the process of what we do,
Oh
you
yeah.
know? And I think it's not unique.
Yeah.
I never want to, and this is always my worry with these kind of conversations, which is not something I have to worry about talking to you about this. But I'm always worried that I will come across like, oh, this is so unique, this is so this, that. No, I mean nothing about what we're talking about is necessarily unique, which is why it's so nice that we can kind of share this with viewers. I mean, you have no idea in some cases who might be listening to this, but they'll be able to get something from it. But I think something my mom kind of imprinted on me at a young age is everything happens for a reason, right? And I kind of live my life in that way. And if there's not a better example of that manifesting in real time, it is exactly what you just said, which is when I finish this piece, something about me will have changed and it will affect the thing that comes directly after it. It is a beautiful part of the process that almost has to happen naturally. I
Yeah.
kind of I embrace, for better or worse, and in my case, worse. In the saxophone concerto's case, worse. But I embrace procrastination because when it happens, it's going to happen in the right way for the reasons that I need it to. The right version of me is going to be present at the time that I'm sitting down to work on this. And the same thing can be said for, not procrastinating and working at that time. If you get to that and you get in that headspace and you're constantly working, the right version of you is going to be sitting down working on that thing that you're working on. And it so directly is going to affect and tie into whatever you do next. I mean, right now, I'm working on a soundtrack release for a film I did like 2 years ago. It was my first feature film, well, first solo feature film. I'm listening back to this work and I'm like, wow, there's so much good here and there's so much bad as well. So much, not bad per se. I shouldn't be so harsh on myself, but there's so much that I would do differently now. And it's fascinating because as I'm pitching for shows and movies and that kind of thing, and working on this soundtrack now, this music that I'm revisiting that I had written 2 years ago. Well, I wrote it then at the right time and it informed what I was working on immediately afterwards. And it was so beneficial. And then now I get to revisit this and know that revisiting this in my voice is it has evolved, or I guess not necessarily my voice per se, because the whole, art craft thing, which we can get into later, but with how much I have grown in craft in the past 2 years. Knowing whatever comes next is also going to be informed by me revisiting the same music. I mean, it's such a beautiful part of the process that I had to pause and highlight, because yes, that's something I relate to so much, so much.
And no matter how deeply I stress about whatever it is I'm doing, it happening at the right time, right place, right time always happens. It's
Yes.
always
Yeah.
there. It always works out.
I like to trust it. And some people are religious, some people are spiritual, as they say. Some people are without any of that. But I think this belief in some way that it's all going to work out. It's some form of faith, even if it's having faith in oneself, is kind of where I have wound up on that spectrum. But having some sort of faith that everything's going to work out the way that it's supposed to, or taking out the supposed to out of it, everything's going to work out, you know. And having that kind of faith when you're approaching a project, I mean, I think can kind of bring you peace. It certainly brings me peace in the most stressful hours, the wee hours of the morning, knowing that you have to deliver something to the orchestrator the next day. I mean, you find peace in that reminder that everything is going to be okay. It's going to work out. I think you have to have an ounce of faith, again, regardless of who or what that is pointed towards. You have to have an ounce of faith, I think, to be a creative. Otherwise, the endeavor is nothing. You know, I can almost guarantee maybe 50 people, if that, will listen to the soundtrack once I release it. But I have faith that, if nothing else, it is a representation of where I was 2 years ago and where I am now. And when it releases, it's something that I get to look back on. Okay, 50 people, maybe it touches their lives for 2 seconds, but I'll have faith that at least I can look back on it and say, wow, look at that.
Yeah.
You know,
That seems like a great place to pause for now. And tune in to part 2 of my conversation with Austin Hammonds next week on the podcast. In the meantime, get to know Austin even better and check out some of his work by visiting his website. That's austinhammonds.com. I'm Tyler Kline, and thank you so much for joining me for this episode of Music Maker. Music Maker with Tyler Kline is a production of Loose Leaf Transmissions, made for all ears. We are online at looseleaftransmissions.com, where you can find more episodes of the podcast, as well as ways to support what we are doing here week after week. That'll do it for my time here with you today. Thanks so much again for listening, and I will see you here next time for the next edition of Music Maker.